Welcome, I'm Kim Byung-ju, a new alternating host for the whole new season of this program, Upfront. Labor reform, for sure, is one of the most contentious issues of our time in Korean politics. So today, we will discuss why this issue has become such a hot political potato now, and what's being discussed as a possible reform measures, and lastly, how these changes may be introduced down the road through the implementation process. And all that is coming up right after this.
According to recent World Bank estimates, Korea's workforce is estimated to decrease by more than 15% over the next 3 decades. This is the biggest estimated drop within the Asia-Pacific region and a prime example of the challenges faced by Korea's labor market. Korea's labor market is fraught with risk factors, including the decrease in the workforce, wide gaps between major companies and SMEs, as well as between regular and non-regular workers, soaring youth unemployment, and outdated compensation systems. To tackle these challenges, President Park Geun-hye has put top priority on labor market reform as a policy focus for the year.
특히 노동시장 개혁은 더 이상 미룰 수 없는 시급하고도 중요한 과제로 이 벽을 넘지 못한다면 우리 경제의 지속 가능한 성장도 어려울 것입니다.
In line with this, the president urged the stakeholders to reach an agreement on structural labor reforms by March 2015. Accordingly, the Economic and Social Development Commission began negotiations between labor and management. However, the Commission failed to narrow the opinion gap within the given time limit of March 2015. On April 24th, thousands of Korean workers went on a general strike in protest of the government's labor policies. Korea's labor market continues to face challenges and deepening conflicts without compromise. On today's Upfront, we conduct an in-depth analysis of the controversies within the labor market and seek solutions.
Well, for the discussion of this important topic today, we have in studio Dr. Bae Kyu-sik of Korea Labor Institute, Professor Kim Woo-young of Gongju National University, and Mr. Lee Won-jae of the Hope Institute, the president, and also Professor Bodain Walraven of Sungkyunkwan University here. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you.
First, let's get to the important point right away. The first question of why this has become such a hot political potato now, at this juncture, at this time. Of course, President Park Geun-hye has mentioned this issue is all about the future of our sons and daughters, probably meaning that it's all about jobs and jobs and jobs, job creation. How do we evaluate that argument? To what extent does it make sense?
We have already serious symptoms of the problems of current employment systems. One is the year before, December, the Supreme Court ruled the regular rate of payment. It poses huge problems with employers and employees as well. And second issues, the level of income in Korea have already reached certain levels, but our working time is too long. And third question is, we have to extend our retirement age because we are facing rapid aging, So this kind of serious symptoms have already showed that we are already late to reform the labor market institutions.
So basically what you're saying is all these things happening all simultaneously, right? Court decision on what many people call ordinary wage, but what you called regular rate of wage. That came in just last year, I suppose?
Year before.
Right, year before, year 2013. And all these things happening in the economy. But does that mean that there's nothing political about it? Job creation is always a hot issue, right?
Yes.
The political timing of it, perhaps?
Yeah. It's a very important political timing. Actually, we have an upcoming election. Yeah, and also we have a general election next year, and also president election in 2 years. So it's a very important political timing. But still, job creation itself has been an issue for about over a decade in Korea after there was a financial crisis.
Right.
After IMF bailout in the late 1990s. And at the time, Korean labor market had a turmoil of massive layoffs. And then there hasn't been a lot of jobs created. In the meantime, even though economic growth has been pretty good, so
So
it's
are we
very
saying
important.
for the last about 20 years so, over time, that period, the job creation has been kind of slowing overall?
It was slowing. It was slowing. So manufacturing is not creating as many jobs as before because of technology changes. And the government is trying to create more social service jobs, but they are not regarded as decent jobs per se. So decent job creation has been very important issue.
If it is so difficult because we're not really ready and prepared for it, why is the president and the government saying it's a golden time? Any explanation for calling it as a golden time? We have to do it now? Why?
Yeah, the Korean economic growth rate has been slowing down. Yeah, this year's growth rate is expected to be about 3.5%, which is much less than the last year. And also the unemployment situation for young people is very serious. Last February, the unemployment rate was about 11%, which is a record high in the last 15 years. So the Korean government feels urgencies to do something about this situation.
That means probably if they act right now, there has to be some kind of result that could push up the overall youth employment and all that kind of stuff. How realistic is this?
I think on top of that, there are fundamental changes in economic and social environment. One is, as he mentioned, we have already gone away from the rapid economic growth to low economic growth.
Right.
Second point is we are facing rapid aging. The third point is we have already in the new international division of labor among East Asian countries.
Globalization.
And also,
Right.
the proportion of our export to East Asia is more than 50%. So we are in the middle of the, Asian society. And fourth point is we have changed our model of family from the male breadwinner model
Right.
toward dual earner models. It's rapid social changes. So we have to adjust our employment system to the fundamentally changed new economic and social environment.
Well, I'd like to add one thing. Yes, it's true that we have very high unemployment rate, but at the same time, we have jobs available in small and medium-sized companies. Yeah, so it's not just we don't have jobs. There is a big job mismatch in the labor market, and we have to foster small and medium-sized firms to produce better quality jobs.
Then these trends that we've been talking about so far are the trends that have been in place at least for the last, I don't know, in my own guess, 5-6 years or maybe 10-20 years so far. Why does this president want to take up that tough responsibility? Is it because she really believes that this reform will quickly produce increase in youth employment, for instance, and all that? Any political observation on this? Why does it have to be her time? I mean, if I were a lazy president, I may want to actually avoid this kind of tough, challenging task, which may be great for the country, but may be difficult for my presidency.
I'm a father, and as a father, I appreciate her comment about my son and daughter. I have one son, I have one daughter. So, but I have a little bit reservation about the goal of this labor market reform. They mentioned job creation, but like Professor Kim mentioned, the imminent problem in the Korean society is he used the term mismatch, but I would use the term inequality. So there is a so-called, in scholarly term, dual labor market problem. So
Right.
Even if you do the same job, you are in the same actual job. If you are in a larger corporation, you are paid better than a same worker in a SME. So that's dual market situation. Also, if you are a contingent worker, non-regular worker, then you are underpaid. You have less benefits than regular worker, which is a permanent employed worker. So this is actually, we call it unequal. And I think in the last decade, this inequality has been increasing. In Korea, politically, people are getting more angry and angry. So it's a time to actually make some action.
Then we have to address this big question out there that a certain part of the public seem to feel that all this labor reform drive is a little bit, seems to be in a little bit hastened mode. What do we see overall as a general observation, very briefly, about the overall speed of it? Is the current government hurrying it too much? What can we say?
Yeah, I think we need more time for discussion, and also we need a better representation of working people. As you know, KCTU, Minjunocheong, is not participating in this three-way dialogue. And
KCTU, the more progressive side of the
Right.
organized
Yeah,
national umbrella organization, right?
Right.
And FKTU is more moderate side. They have been participating, and recently they've been exiting the talk as well, right? So,
and the proposals being raised are mostly related to big companies, and the big companies are members of KCTU. So it's very important to draw participation from KCTU to have a better representation and have a better outcome of this dialogue.
right. Did just for as a record, did KCTU ever participate in a trilateral commission where government and the business and the labor leaders participated?
They haven't participated in this tripartite committee, but they participate in the reforming unemployment insurance system and the minimum wage system. So they partly participated, but they haven't participated in this kind of social dialogue.
It's quite different issues, but not just the aging issues, but also, as he mentioned, as Mr. Lee mentioned, the dualization of the labor market has become serious. It's not sustainable anymore because the decent job is becoming a bit smaller and smaller, and non-regular workers and low-wage workers, the groups are becoming larger and larger. So the young graduates are fighting for the decent job, small number of decent job. That's why they are waiting, they delay their graduation, and they go abroad to learn English. And so they enter labor market by, I think, later than other countries by 5 years.
I'm sure about that, yeah.
Because of the
I've been seeing those
late
kids,
entry into the labor market, they marry late, they give birth late, so it causes huge problems in Korean society. So we must tackle that issues. But the crisis, the employment crisis in Korean society is a different kind of crisis. For example, in Netherlands, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was economic crisis as well as unemployment crisis. At the time, unemployment rate was high, but in the current unemployment in Korea is relatively low, apart from the youth unemployment rate. So we call it low intensity crisis.
Right.
So some people feel comfortable, but some other people, for example, workers in the low wage sector and non-regular workers, they are not comfortable with the current situation.
Right.
But
And that has to do with the labor market structure itself that we've been talking about, the dualism, right?
Yes.
Because people who seek job can get a job, unprotected, low-paying jobs.
that's one of the biggest issues in Korea.
Right.
Yeah.
So therefore, we have all these reasons why the government may have to actually undertake the reform measures at this point, and there are political expectations and demands that are rising, to which the current leadership must respond to, I suppose. We have a lot to talk about, as you may have noticed here. So we will talk about those kind of issues one by one. For instance, what kind of changes are expected? And then afterwards, towards the end, we will talk about implementation issue. But for now, let's cover those specific issues, the major ones that needs to be worked out in the process of this labor reform next. Well, let me start the second part of our discussion in an easier way as a MC here. What do you think is, among that long list of contentious issues here, what do you think is the most difficult one to tackle? I'm sure you have many of them, but let's start with any. Professor Wolmraven.
That's a really difficult question.
They're all
but
difficult.
I think actually the major task is to give the people enough jobs with a living wage,
Right.
so and enough security for people to accept also sometimes periods maybe that things might be a little bit less. For instance, no wage increase like happened in Holland, for instance. But it only is possible to accept something like that if there's already a certain sense of security. And the government somehow should, that's an enormous task.
So you're suggesting government should perhaps act first to provide more protection and safety net first, in order to have an easier environment to reach any kind of agreement?
I think maybe these things should be mentioned at the same time. So when you look at the present proposals, there's actually very little that's attractive to labor. It's more for the benefit of companies to have an easier time when they want to get rid of people, maybe, and things like that.
But in Korea, my question goes to all of you here, but in Korea, among the conservatives, there is a sense that for the last about 20 years, Korean labor, ever since probably from the end of 1980s, Korean labor has gained so much in terms of their wage, job protection, and benefits and all that kind of stuff. Conservatives say it's time to kind of take a step back. But if we increase further protection of this kind of benefits and then transitional things and all that kind of stuff, there will be political backlash, I suppose, right?
But it's not true. I mean, probably...
That's conservative thinking, not necessarily my voice. But right.
Sorry about that. But if you take a look at a real-term wage, it's been very slow for the last 6-7 years, maybe 10 years. So on average, even though Korean economy was growing, global companies were gaining more and more market share in the global markets, laborers were not getting their share. But it's true that in some workplaces, like well-protected workplaces,
right,
in large corporations, manufacturing, they are getting more wages and benefits. But overall, especially for contingent non-regular workers, it's been very harsh.
So overall, what we're talking about is the end point seems to be clear. We want to see a country where overall wage rises in a satisfactory level, but because of the polarization we've been talking about, right, the dual market structure, there has been one group that has seen fast rise of the wages, while the larger majority, has been suffering from a low rate of growth here, right? Yeah. So what the government is talking about in terms of addressing this polarization itself, it's something that's being shared by many people as something that's necessary. The question is how that can be done. But
there are two point of view on how to reform to that kind of, the high level of wages at the large firms and public sector, and low wages and worst working condition in small and medium-sized company. One is the conservative view is they insist on the reform of the labor market in large firms and public sector. But on the other hand, the left-leaning side, they argue for the how to raise the bottom levels of small and medium-sized workers in small and medium-sized company and non-regular workers. I think we have to take into account both sides of the viewpoint. So on the one hand, we have to slow down the level of wages among large firms and public sector.
Right.
And we have to make labor force more flexible, internally flexible. So we have to use labor force in the large firms and public sector more flexibly. But on the one hand, maintaining the employment security. On the other hand, we have to raise the bottom level of workers' wages in the small and medium-sized company and temporary workers. So we have to act at the same time.
Right.
Otherwise, we cannot rebalance the already different dualization of labor market.
Actually, the thing is that's a great point, because what we are talking about here is very complicated structure. One highly organized, large-sized firm labor union getting a lot of benefits and seeing their benefits growing fast, and small and medium companies, workers working there as regular workers. And at the bottom, we have this irregular workers, temporary workers, who do not see much of the protection for their job as well as wage here. So should we focus on the last group first here, talking about their problems and what needs to be done? Of course, we have a huge gap here in terms of where they stand and then where other groups stand here. What needs to be done, or what can be done about this, so-called temporary unprotected workers? What needs to be done first for them? I mean, raising wage would be an easy way out of it, but
one of the ways the government is thinking is to increase minimum wages. Yeah, so minimum wages in Korea is not very high among OECD countries. I look at the recent report. Korea is ranked about 15 out of 25 OECD countries. But the problem is an increase in minimum wage can have negative effect on employment. So many countries are worrying about this kind of a negative effect. So Korean government is in dilemma. Now they have been talking about increasing minimum wages to 10,000 won per hour, but they haven't really thought deeply about the adverse effect on employment. So on the one hand, it can help low-income workers, but on the other hand, it can reduce the job opportunities.
And that's particularly because those people who hire these, lowest group of the workers are the ones who own smallest possible businesses in terms of size and so on, and they're very sensitive to the wage level. So, as you mentioned, if minimum wage rises, there will be fewer jobs for sure. So that's a really tough one to crack here. But what about other issues such as what government is trying to do, extending the contracts? Currently, like 2 years is a term for the temporary workers, and often companies do this practice of letting them go because after 2 years they have to make them a permanent workers. So these people have to lose their jobs every 2 years. Government wants to extend it to 4 years. What's the meaning behind that, and is there any significance? We understand the labor union has been opposing that idea.
I understand why the government is trying to do this, because government think extending this contract period to 4 years can actually stabilize the employment situation for non-regular workers. So if the contract is 2 years, then at the end of the 2 years, the non-regular workers are likely to be released. So they want to extend it to 4 years to have more secure jobs. But the initial purpose of this non-regular workers law was to actually convert non-regular workers to regular workers at the end of the 2 years term. But if they extend it to 4 years, I'm afraid that it may increase the number of non-regular workers. And I wonder whether that's what the government wants to do.
But there's a voice on the side of business, right, who are saying this measure may be necessary because we cannot hire people as permanent workers because of the drawbacks, right? Can anyone reflect the conservative or business perspective on this? The business hesitance in terms of hiring or converting non-permanent workers or temporary workers into the status of permanent workers?
In a way, it's a burden to the companies, of course, but in a way, you should accept certain burdens. So there's a kind of minimum which should be respected. And personally, I think that actually one way to maybe to make the extension to 4 years acceptable is to give people who don't have a regular contract certain benefits, similar or the same, maybe even as regular workers, for instance, building up a pension or things like that, so that they have some extra perks and are not so different in a way from the regular workers. That could be quid pro quo or something to offer in exchange for this extension maybe from 2 to 4 years. Then you have something to negotiate at least. I don't know what the labor unions would think.
I think the issues was a bit exaggerated because
exaggerated by whom? The government or the labor union?
Among the media, because the actual number of people who are affected by the extension of fixed-term contract from 2 years to 4 years is 80,000 employees. So not many, but it was much publicized. So we should focus on the other issues. For example, labor unions argues that employers have to employ as regular workers if the job post was continuous and also permanent. Sometimes employers replace the fixed-term contract, one fixed-term contract. At the end of one fixed-term contract, they replace other fixed-term contract.
Right, that's a wide practiced thing here in Korea, right?
But if the job post is permanent and also continuous, we have to set a criteria whereby we have to employ regular non-permanent workers rather than temporary workers, because the post need more permanent and continuous jobs.
But the thing is, of course, that's a very important point in terms of recognizing a certain job as a job that should not be tricked in terms of this kind of old Korean practice of using the temporary workers. But the thing is, once again, the business concern here is that once we hire or change a certain position into a permanent job, business side finds it very difficult to let people go when their business goes down south. And looks like in this time when the government and business side are trying to reform the labor market, they want to make it easier for the business to let go the people when situation turns worse. Any progress or any challenges that we see on this side, President Lee Won-jae of Hope Institute?
Yeah, it is true that business environment is changing rapidly. But the thing is that a lot of jobs we are talking about here are very low-paid domestic jobs. So if you have one person in a position as a 2-year contract term, then it means he or she is like a bookkeeper of a company or a secretary of your office, positions like that, or social service worker, like it's cleaning job or it's a guarding job. So those are major non-regular contingent jobs in Korea now. So it's very, it's sort of a mismatching argument, right? When you talk about business environment, it's global exporters.
But sir, what about the dispatched workers? I don't know whether that's the right term or not. But
agency workers.
What is it called?
Agency workers.
Agency workers. assembly lines, there are a lot of agency workers who are dispatched from this, what do you call it, employment company, whatever, that actually hire people, and then their job is sending people to these assembly lines. That's also very extensive practice, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So here is a dualization. So if you talk about give more protection for workers, you should talk about this dispatched workers or contingent workers. Then it becomes you need to have more regular jobs if the job is permanent. But when we talk about the regular jobs in larger corporations or in the public sector, then we talk about easing the regulations about layoffs. So those are two different regulations.
Right. And we do actually have over 10,000 court cases every year disputing this kind of layoff decisions, isn't it?
Yes and no to questions. Because trade unions at the large firms, they have a strong power to resist any form of dismissals. So it's very difficult for employers to get rid of redundant workers. But on the other hand, small and medium-sized companies, they can easily dismiss workers.
And they do that, would you argue? They do that?
Yes.
Okay.
But the problem is how to tackle these issues. On the one hand, we have to breach some kind of standard and criteria whereby the employees at large firms can change their jobs to the small and medium-sized company. But the current problem is the big gaps in wages between large firms and small firms.
Right.
So if employees at large firms, if they lose their jobs, they cannot find alternative jobs to guarantee the similar level of wages. That's why we resist.
Right.
So we have to balance. And on the other hand, the employers, they would like to take advantage of big gaps between large firms and small firms. So they tend to outsource unnecessary and unimportant jobs.
Relatively speaking.
Relatively, to the small-sized company, and they also hire in-house subcontractors rather than using regular workers. Unless these issues are addressed.
Right. Together at the same time.
Yes.
Right.
But the problem is nobody goes that direction so far. We need more employment infrastructure to tackle these issues. It's quite fundamental issues.
Right. We have to manage time here, but among those very difficult issues where the ends and beginning are all intertwined and it's chicken and egg problem, we are not certain how we should address these issues one by one. But we have to add one more important issue, and we have to manage it within a short time here. That is the peak wage system, together with the extended retirement age. There's another. It looks like this is another issue that's very much intermingled here. Any good idea or suggestions about how we should go about resolving this issue? Those issues are, the changes are needed on both sides here, right?
The seniority issues in Korea, especially large firms and public sector, doesn't necessarily match the level of skills, knowledge, and responsibility. Sometimes their wages go higher than their level of skill and responsibility and knowledge. So
if you sit in your position for long enough, you just get paid more and more every year, right? That's what you're saying, right?
But the seniority problem in Korea is also a bit exaggerated because the average years of service among Korean employees is 5.5 years.
Okay.
It's much shorter than the average year of service in other countries. And the proportion of more than 10 years service among the whole workforce is 18.9%, whereas the proportion of workforce with at least 10 years of service in other countries is around 38 to 50%.
That's a global average, would you say?
OECD.
OECD, okay.
But the curve among the long year of service is much sharper in Korea than other countries. So we must address that issues to guarantee our retirement age up to legal retirement, limit.
So what you're saying is the pressure for the peak wage system that's being talked about is not as great.
But
You're saying,
but it's necessary.
Right? It's necessary, but
Yeah.
it's not as pressing. So it can come in more smoother way. Basically, it doesn't have to be a really stern measure or anything like that. It's not that bad, and it should come in gradually. That's your point.
But it's quite temporary issues. If we are guaranteed up to our legal retirement age, we have to reconfigure our career path. So much slower. In the past, we have very thick and rapid rising in career path.
Sure.
But now we have to slow down our career path.
I want to
So we have to play with the overall expectations here as well. And Professor Kim?
Yeah. I'd like to mention about retirement age. Many developed countries, such as US, Canada, and Australia, they abolished mandatory retirement. I was in Australia 2 years ago in University of Sydney, and the professors there don't have any retirement age.
So that's better for the workers? Or is it better
it's
for the...
it's better for workers, of
but
course.
with that system, can business say, tell them you should go because we don't have a retirement age?
They abolished the retirement age because of the anti-age discrimination.
So you can sit there and do your work as long as you want.
Right. Some of the professors said, I'm going to die in my office. But
I thought that's what all professors in Korea say
right.
these days.
But the thing is,
if possible.
So I asked one of the colleagues, do you have any problem for the jobs for young people?
Right.
Yeah. So I think the extending retirement age can work if the economy provides enough jobs for young people.
Right.
For Australian case, they have been their economic growth has been very rapid, and they enjoyed really good economic growth. So they could abolish this mandatory retirement without worrying about young people. But in Korea, the situation is a little bit different.
Right.
So we are in kind of a dilemma. We want to extend the retirement age for providing more jobs for older people,
right.
But we have to also think about young generations.
Let's move on to talk about how realistic it would be to introduce these kind of changes that are necessary. I don't think we are even halfway done in terms of talking about the necessary changes to be introduced and all that, but we have to move on, and let's talk about those overseas cases of supposedly successful reform of the labor market. So we will move on to talk about the Dutch case as well as German case in our next segment of this discussion. Now to learn the German experience, we are connecting with Mr. Aihi Horst, Werner Aihi Horst of the Institute for the Study of Labor in Germany. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, first question. In Korea, those of us watching the issue of labor reform frequently heard of the name the Hartz Reform. Please tell us briefly about what this name actually stands for and what it was all about.
The basic idea of the Hartz reforms was to modernize the public employment service and to make active labor market policies more effective. This is one thing. And the other main objective was to make the labor market more flexible, especially by liberalizing so-called non-standard forms of employment or atypical employment contracts.
You know, we all know that all good ideas that actually works at one place at a certain time needs to be modified and adjusted to work elsewhere in other times. So for that, I want to ask you this question. What were some of the German-specific conditions and the circumstances that may need to be modified, to be applied elsewhere this time? And maybe the German conditions that may not be replicated elsewhere?
So the basic insight that we now can make is that if you start deregulating non-standard forms of employment, you may want to increase employment on the one hand and bring down unemployment, but you'll have some sort of disparity in the quality of jobs in such a system. So I think countries should really consider how to balance some flexibility in the core of the labor market, i.e. with those people on permanent contracts, with some sort of security and stability for those working on flexible contracts. And I think this is, the major issue. And if I understand your discussion in Korea, or your current discussion correctly, I think the government is trying to address this quite effectively.
And finally, any general points of lessons you may want us to, here in Korea, to keep in mind in seeking to reform our labor market here?
So I think what is very important is to have two things. One is effective general or universal standards in terms of social protection, but also in terms of remuneration at work. And the second thing that I also think is very important is to have an operative, effective social dialogue between trade unions and employers, so that major fragmentations and major divides in the labor markets are somehow eased.
Thank you, Mr. Eichhorst, for your wonderful words on the German experience. Okay, now let's get back to our guests here. We have heard enough stories about German case as well as earlier the Dutch case here. Now the question is how these changes can be implemented here in Korea. And in addition to all that long list of challenging issues that needs to be dealt with and understood, let's talk about the implementation. So far, for the last about 20 years, we have had this vehicle called the Trilateral Commission, where the leadership of the business, labor, and the government politics have been participating. And recently we have seen some difficulties in terms of this Trilateral Commission producing supposedly needed necessary results. What do we see ahead in terms of its future? Any fundamental problems with this particular vehicle? What can we say?
When we have more broad social consensus, then we can reach an agreement on the labor market reform. But the current situation, the labor market actors, for example, employers and trade unions, they act like a calculative, actor. So they calculate whether the reform can be beneficial or detrimental to the interest. So we have to have more broad social consensus, which way we have to go in terms of our employment systems. Otherwise, we cannot reach tripartite agreement among tripartite commission.
So what the tripartite, trilateral or tripartite commission is being told is that you should produce agreement. You should produce certain points where all three parties agree, and so that we can introduce the reform. You're saying we need more discussion outside the commission?
And also other actors, for example, elderly people and the youth, and also temporary workers, they have to have a voice in the tripartite commissions.
Can the commission actually work as a way to generate greater debate outside themselves, or are they just mostly focused on, by nature, their own discussions? Who will lead this kind of encouragement of the further discussions?
Unfortunately, it is not, the discussion has not been publicly released to the media and among general public. So the internal groups and high-ranking groups, they talked a lot about the important issues, but the ordinary people don't know what kind of issues are, why they have become issues.
Well, let's talk about further of such problem right there a little bit more. But before we move on, Professor Kim, the participation of the labor unions in the tripartite commission itself is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we have a representation problem. I mentioned earlier the KCTU, but also there are other groups like non-regular workers, elderly workers, young people. So they need some delegations to be sent to this tripartite
In a way, the
commission.
labor unions in Korea are quite different from labor unions, for instance, in the Netherlands, in the fact that, for instance, they're organized by company.
Right.
And if someone is fired, there was not so long ago was an incident about this, you could no longer be a member of this labor union. But if we have more comprehensive labor unions, which may include people who are also out of work, for instance, then they might be a better partner actually in this tripartite.
Yeah, exactly.
The union density in Korea
discussion.
is only about 10%. I look at the statistics for Netherlands when they had this bicentennial agreement. The union density rate was about 30%. So it's much higher than Korean representation. So we just not only include the representatives from unions, but we need to have other representatives from other areas.
And unions are more representative of a broader group of people actually also at that time.
So are we saying basically, as one of the points that we may have to wrap up with in a few minutes, is that we may need some kind of different kind of vehicle for national discussion here for resolving this so-called labor market reform here, going over and beyond the trilateral commission? Mr. Lee, what do you see?
So what I see is that it's very, very difficult in Korea to have right representation by trade unions. If you go to just per se automobile industry, you have you can have an industry level trade union,
Right.
but still there is Hyundai Motors, and Hyundai Motors union has a dominant power in that umbrella organization. So if you have this kind of industry structure, it affects labor union power scheme. So it's very hard to have a right representation in the tripartite talk. So I think this tripartite talk is very, very good and necessary, but it cannot solve job creation in general and inequality in the labor market in general. They can solve this peak wage specific issues. But overall, you should, if you want to have a younger generation and this non-regular worker representation, you need to bring it to the National Assembly. Actually, so political parties should take some actions. They are now sort of backing out from the hot discussion to protect themselves. It's actually not a job of politicians. They have to actually do a debate.
Very important point. I want to have a feedback from Professor Kim here. Good idea to have discussion taking place more inside the National Assembly?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. But this tripartite system had worked in some areas, such as...
it has. The public seems to feel that nothing has worked, but there have been some issues.
Like this constructing the unemployment insurance, for example, and the workers' compensation law, and reducing working time. And there has been some areas that it has worked, actually. So we cannot just throw away this system. But I think we just add some more elements and make a better representation of the working force.
And more discussion inside the National Assembly. Dr. Bae, as our final point, would you agree actually the politicians taking up this difficult responsibility of talking about labor reform is the better way to go? More of politicians coming in at the National Assembly?
Sometimes yes, but not always the case. The last year, the one branch of parliament, they initiated that kind of social dialogue among opposition and ruling party together with some
they had
experts.
A special kind of a committee or something?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
right,
yes.
right.
But they failed to reach an agreement on similar issues. So it is not always easy for the parliament to reach an agreement on specific issues between ruling party and opposition party.
But looks like consensus here is that the politicians are the ones who should take upon the responsibility of getting the discussion going down the road. It's too bad that we have run out of time now, but looks like this is one issue that needs and deserves more discussion down the road. So certainly we will revisit again and again this very particularly important issue for our society. But for now, we want to wrap up here. Big thanks to all of our guests here for your wonderful discussion today. And very special thanks to all of our viewers and listeners who have joined us from all around the world. Thank you very much. And certainly, we hope that you will come back here for this program Upfront next time. Goodbye.